Greetings. Non audet stigius Pluto tentare quad adute, Ephrenis monachus planaco dolis annus. The devil of hell does not dare attempt that which the wanton monk dares, nor the old woman full of wiles. Salutations, scholars and masters. Some of you may know me as Endymion the Dork-at-Arms, etc. Others may know me by my true name. But today we are not here to bandy-creed words with simple bookworms like myself. Today we are here to start on a journey to investigate and analyze historical fencing manuscripts, or fight books, through the lens of media anthropology. But first, let's get philosophical for a moment and ask, what even is a podcast? Just to get very heady for a moment. So this acts as a warning. There will be a little bit of theory-heavy discussion here. And quite simply, I will be learning this along with you, but I will do my best to explain as I go along. So, if we discuss what is a podcast, the podcast is a medium that is purely auditory. So this presentation is both a podcast and a cheap YouTube version of a video essay. C'est la vie. To some, this may come off as cheap, to others insincere, but this is the best that I can do with the technology available to me. My very simple microphone, my Zoom, my lack of funding for proper audio editing and video editing software, etc. So then, who is this for? This is for fencers, artists, anthropologists, historians, the layperson who may just want some background noise to block out the sound of the neighbor's dog, whatever the case may be. But we are discussing, first of all, why fencing in a podcast? Well, I chose a podcast for several reasons. I could say that it's a break from the skullduggery of academies and essay writing. I could also say that this is a pattern for me to really set a new standard for my own hobby of YouTube creation. And also this gives me an excuse, as it were, excuse in huge quotation marks, to read through all of my fencing books. But more than anything, I haven't written a long-form piece of writing that wasn't for school purely in 2 years. So this is a brilliant opportunity for me to do that. So then why the hell is it about fencing? To which I say very simply, swords are cool. Enough said. But then why through media anthropology? Because anthropology is, as a study of humans, it is both an art and a science. And fencing cannot be seen in any other way rather than both art and science. We would assume that these two fields are perfectly discreetly delineated, but the truth is that they are very, very close. And fencing demonstrates this more than anything. If you see fencing as purely science, you're erasing the oral traditions, that transmission from pupil to master. You're erasing the regional styles of swords that crop up between cultures and that change over time. You erase the simple fact that pictorial representations are essential to many, many of these fight books. And of course, you also give no room for subjective interpretation or for a sort of cultural transcendence based on shared heritage. Conversely, if you see fencing as an art alone, then you're forgetting the foundational Aristotelian math and those mathematical philosophies, the innovations in metallurgy, the masters and the writers' understanding of human biomechanics, so our joints and muscles and such, and how we want to bend, and of course you negate the critical discourses that these fight books represent, that we are now discussing. So in method, theory, ideals, and practice, which we could all argue are kind of the same, fencing is engaging with artistic and scientific worldviews and all the like. Now, I put these out of order, my apologies. Now, I would like to review a few quick terms. First of all, Fightbook. The fight book is the literal translation. This is a German term. You notice that I described MS 133, which is the fencing manual that we will be examining. I will describe this as fight book, as the tower fight book, or as the Walpurga Fechtbook. Walpurga being one of the named figures, the only named figure in this entire treatise. Now, I would also like to point out that I am doing this as a member of a much larger movement called HEMA. We are a reconstructive effort regarding the archaic ways of self-defense that have been recorded in European history. HEMA means historical, so it must be source-based, European, so now we have a regional focus, martial arts. And there you go. But it is also inherently interpretive. We're going off of these books and we're trying to experiment with them. So how do you start experimenting with MS 133? The Walpurga Fechtbook, the Tower Fight Book. Well, I would argue that first you have to go... Sorry, this is my title page for our ridiculous and surprising podcast series, hopefully. But we begin with the actual context of what this text is. So, like many manuals, this book has meandered through the libraries and collections of churches, aristocrats, private collectors, etc., since its creation in the early 14th century, somewhere in the German territories. Based on the literacy rates of the time and the 3 or so distinct pens inscribing its knowledge, the attire as well, which we will return to in a little bit, almost certainly name this as written by and for clerics, which I would say as a category can include non-ordained church attendants, which explain Walpurga, the woman, the only woman in this fight book, and perhaps in the entire fight book tradition. These clerics seem to study a system of infantry combat using the arming sword, which is this weapon, a single-handed, double-edged weapon, and the buckler is a small shield with this sort of domed top over the hand. Now, the system itself is exceptionally unique to the Fechtbook, according to numerous scholars, because while most sort of sword and buckler systems present the sword and the buckler together almost at all times, the Walpurga Fechtbook opens with many primary stances, which we shall call guards or wards, or in the Latin, custodia, to break this rule by separating the sword and buckler. So, notably, the manual is also incomplete. It shows, as you can see, one position called the underarm, sort of down here. Sorry, I'm a little cramped. But even with several quires, several pages and folios missing from this actual text, it is a rich peek into medieval self-defense. But now we will apply the anthropological theory rather than the historical. We begin with Marshall McLuhan, the 20th century, very quippy and poetical philosopher. One of his quintessential remarks and claims is the phrase, "the medium is the message." Medium refers to the means, object, or mode of physical manifestation of an art through for art or entertainment. So a canvas is a medium. Painting is a medium. But the canvas doesn't have an image on it, or rather there is no image produced until you put an idea through the medium. Art can't exist, but in this light, MS 133 becomes a literal emanation of the category fight book. It is a medium that acts as preserving a fencing style on the page and extends the life of that knowledge. The voices of the writers now are expanded by a manuscript acting as sort of prosthesis. So now if we look at the medium itself of the fight book, we enter into a hylomorphic understanding. Hylomorphic being hylos, matter, morphic, as in morphos, form, the relationship between form and matter. It leads us to one of McLuhan's other main titles, the Gutenberg Galaxy. This concept is named for the literate technologies of pen and printer, so central to the spread of these early texts, including Fightbooks. McLuhan notes that this universe of expression, this set of systems, is reliant on a purely visual logic of signs, which is to say, particular language. An image can be interpreted and contemplated across numerous landscapes, but MS-133 is an image amalgamate. It holds many images. It holds many, many texts within itself, as it were. So it is necessary with this copy, with this translation, to mention 2 or 3 scribal issues. The first being that there are 2 actual authors. And at least one person, one of these hands, has been correcting the other. We can see this in the literal facsimile pages. If we go back to that previous slide, we might be able to see where pages have been scribbled out. Fortunately, we can't in those images. My apologies. But now, of course, the Gutenberg universe, galaxy, contains a different problem, which is that an English reader, such as myself, has to have this translated. Written in faded calligraphy, even before translation, we have to have this Latin transcribed into a legible typeface. So the question of legibility and comparing images to words and learning this system of signs, it's a lot of work for the reader, isn't it? It's a lot of mental work. It would be so much easier if we had video presentations to explain these techniques, now wouldn't it? But that is a completely different medium. And these different mediums, as McLuhan proposes, excite the mind in different ways because they excite different senses. He uses the metaphor of hot and cold media. In his analysis, it is the engagement of an audience's mental faculties based on sensory input, but it's actually kind of counterintuitive how he labels what is hot and what is cold. The cold medium engages with high participation of the audience, and the hot medium is low participation. A television is a cold medium because you have to fill in the gaps and learn genre conventions. You have to do mental work to a certain extent. But it engages both the sight and sound. It engages multiple senses. Now, if we are to say, have a radio show or a podcast, it focuses in on a single, the auditory input. And the information is kind of, as he puts it, kind of spoon-fed to you. So rather than having to fish for literal meaning or subtext, it is very simply delivered to you. This fight book itself could be considered a hot medium because it excites the sight greatly. It doesn't do anything auditorially. I don't open this up and there's a Hallmark song playing, because everything is literally spelled out for the reader as well. And it's demonstrated by the corresponding images. However, we lack a great deal of oral tradition. And therefore, we've lost the majority of the system's context and how it should be taught, the system of teaching, the pedagogy. And so the audience today has to investigate and experiment with sparring and the like. The context being read now metamorphosizes the text and metamorphosizes McLuhan's kind of limited theory. And it brings into sharp focus how central imagination is to engaging with this text. So now we transition to Edward Casey's book, Spirit and Soul, Essays in Philosophical Psychology, where he explains that there are classical models of cognition which place imagination in a hierarchy. And imagination is the lowest, the senses are the lowest, but the imagination is an intermediary between the senses and a higher conceptual understanding. And Casey asks us to go beyond this model, but given that Thomas Aquinas, Avicenna, other medieval writers used this model, it would be worthwhile to apply this model to MS-133. This sort of mental scala natura is kind of essential, because as we are reading through these descriptions, a student could set up a sequence or play that is described, attempts to follow the visual and scriptural instructions. And in doing so, the fencer is moving between sensory and tactile information and an image-based learning. The imagination and the image work is at play. Image work being the imagination. The imagination is not where images are made, but where they are mediated, where they are negotiated with, where they are worked. So the imagination is image work, as it were. But then in moving through the play itself, you have to engage with your senses in real time. And if the play is repeated, if it is mutated, and you begin some meta-analysis with investigating, okay, what if I want to play around? What if I want to do something different that's not written in there? How is this weak? You begin quite simply to gain from the senses through your imagination. You are gaining greater conceptual knowledge of this system. But drilling does not a swordmaster make. At this time, the Fightbook would be situated in living memory, so people alive would know how to teach this at the time that this is written. And in learning and teaching, they would be enacting a word-of-mouth transmission, the oral tradition, I call it. And we don't have that today. We have that for classical foil and classical saber, but we don't have that for the arming sword and buckler. So it is something of a dead knowledge source. It extended the life of whatever was being passed on orally, but now it is a piece of dead knowledge. It's not just a physical reminder of techniques, it's less familiar. And so the image that we have to deal with each page, it is no longer a reminder of the techniques we have already been taught, as we are not contemporary to a living system. It is now, as I said, dead knowledge. We see only stills. We see only still pictures, but these are movements captured. We have to remember that. These are not just stagnant plates. These are motions and movements in image. So we have to acknowledge the limits of this medium. And this is called medium specificity, which Martin Heidegger described a great deal of. Medium specificity, I realize this is a lot on the page. I'm just going to move some things around. He describes 4 causes: the object itself, the material cause, the cause of efficiency, and the end goal. All of these causes come together. If we think about what causes lie behind or underneath a particular technology, in this case a Fightbook, then we are allowing the aletheia, the sort of dynamic essential truth of the technology, to be brought forth. He likes this phrase, bringing forth, and he likes the phrase challenging forth. Challenging forth and bringing forth for Heidegger are 2 complementary things. They're both revealing. They reveal the instrumentality, which is to say the literal simplistic answer of what is it? Instrumentality is, for a technology itself. What is the answer to what is this object? And this sees technology as only a means to an end, but Heidegger wants us to look at these 4 causes to give us a more artistic view, so that the technology, the sword and buckler, the Fightbook, etc., reveal their own epistemology. Down here at the bottom, we understand his phrase of inframing, that technology is a way to perceive the world. Technology is an epistemology. A technology, for instance, a Fightbook or a sword and buckler paired together, that is a system of knowing. That is a system of gaining, creating, and spreading knowledge. And in looking at these 4 causes, it is a book. It is a limited, simple medium. But the object is useful because while it separates the sword and buckler quite a great deal, it that also creates, in terms of fencing terms, an invitation being an opening to the body by which you can then fool the opponent. And the end goal is the self-defense. It is a commoner's self-defense tool in this case, because it is, again, clerics, not ordained priests, not knights, clerics who are teaching this. So the inframing of MS-133 presents to us its aletheia, its fundamental truth. And I focus in on the matter of the separating of sword and buckler because it is so drastically distinct for MS-133 compared to other sword and buckler texts. And they end almost always with lethal strikes to the head, which is not unusual per se, but it is quite telling. So the tensions between a martial starting with a defensive position versus the custodia that we are presented with, the guards of MS-133, which are very open, very inviting, presents a tension between the instinct of self-preservation and what is the actual martial ethic. So here is my main thesis for this podcast series, that in investigating MS-133 through media anthropology, we can understand the martial ethic of these clerics. And I would argue that they have no martial ethic. Allow me to demonstrate very briefly. Imagine you are in a churchyard. You are being robbed by some kind of soldiers, marauding mercenaries. You have some antiques off the wall. You don't really know how to use this because you only learned it like once a year, 5 years ago, 1 day a year. And you come here. You're cowering. You're saying, oh, please don't hurt me. But you've already picked up the weapons. You have spelled your death. But you are also Catholic. And you believe that you may die a martyr's death and still go to heaven. You are a cleric. You have been serving the house of God. So what this becomes is, I'm portraying myself as meek, but in truth, I may still strike with this. I can still come forward. An experienced soldier isn't going to take that position because an experienced soldier knows I'm going to keep this in front of me and I'm going to keep my sword and buckler together because the buckler protects my hands and the like. So from these limited, stagnant pages, we can come to some very lethal conclusions and very controversial conclusions regarding the martial ethic, the ethos of these clerics. How do they approach war? Well, they approach it not on a basis of self-defense, but self-sacrifice. And so the medium here, as Heidegger would put it, this challenges forth. It brings our assumption as a reader that we would think these clerics know how to fence. Quite frankly, they do, but not in a way which we would understand. Because, as I said, it is self-sacrifice. It is a strategy of martyrdom. If they kill me, a soldier must now pay Wehrgeld, the mangold, according to German law. Now, the strategy of martyrdom that I will propose to you with, I will give credit to my instructor, Nytshaed, also known as Douglas Leonard, as the one who proposed this image. We are interpreting a book removed from its writer, from its oral tradition by several centuries, and we are relying upon various degrees of detail. So, for instance, this page here has all of one line of Latin. I'm not sure if you can see that. Hic fit mutadio gladiis inferioris. Whereas, if we go much earlier, we come to our opening play and we have an entire page of actual dialogue that we are engaging with this text. So we have varying degrees of description. And we also have plays that seem to describe very awkward turnings of the hand, which do not make sense biomechanically. This means that we have to understand these images as partially as analogies. They are not perfect literal representations. But I would also like to get into that aspect I mentioned earlier, that these are pictures in motion. Now, this is an image which is particularly moving to me. This was an image by Etienne Jules Marais, French, very early motion picture experimenter. And he captured what Gunning, Member, and Braun, three very brilliant historians, would describe as a movement image. We can see this fencer moving through a technically perfect lunge according to classical tradition. It is a technique that is essential to my work in foil and in rapier, and quite frankly, it is essential to see this movement, but I can't. Rather, I can't take a third-person view and look at myself unless I'm looking in a mirror. This, on the other hand, demonstrates a master's execution. This image captures the dynamism, and it reveals so much regarding the technique, regarding, things that words cannot do justice to. And I would argue that the motion images, the movement images of MS-133 do the same, but in a completely different way, and in a way that for us is incomplete, as I've mentioned, because we do not have that oral history. And so interpreting it as I've proposed with the strategy of martyrdom, it's severely limited, and our discussion is unfortunately severely limited, but it is one that I will hopefully develop throughout this season. But for us historical fencers and visual anthropologists and laypersons with an interest in swords, these interpretations and experimentations, when we look at these fight books, when we try to analyze them, these are remediations, if that makes sense. If you put an idea onto the canvas or onto the page, you are mediating. You are literally putting it onto a medium. And through this discussion, we are remediating both the original text and the various thoughts regarding images, regarding the Scala Natura, regarding Aristotelian philosophy. And with our post-industrial media of the internet, the video camera, and essays like this, we can actually mediate this with our own system of knowledge. And we can revivify, we can reanimate the knowledge of MS-133 through drills, sparring, tournaments. And even though we're doing this from dead knowledge of the book, and we are doing this from our own limited lack of oral tradition, we are, I would say, all of us, one and all, amateurs. There are no virtuosi of sword and buckler because we are not formally trained. We, again, lack those living lineages. So, as I believe it's Rabineau who discusses this word of amateur, please do not think this is pejorative. I say this as a loving act, literally, amateur, ama. It is a French word, but there is the Latin root for love there. The amateur for Rabineau is the loving, passionate sort of student scientist. And again, fencing is both science and art. We are amateurs. We love fencing. We love swords, and we love doing this because it is fun, because it is great exercise, because it is fascinating. But none of us have that unbroken lineage of oral transmission, and so none of us are true masters. We have wonderful techniques which are mastered for more martial conduct or for more sporty conduct in tournaments. But no matter how you put it, we are all in HEMA, we are all amateurs. And that is beautiful, and that is fantastic, and it opens so many doors. Again, if fencing is purely science, we do not have room for personal taste or style or interpretation. There is only the presumption of hard evidence. But even so, we do use hard evidence. So I'm not dismissing any scholarly expertise or an instructor's accrued experience with the system, but I'm doing this in a proud recognition of the study as fencing. So my peers and my masters, I say that we are all lovers of science. We are all invested in this discipline, this beautiful art and science. Now, this leaves many questions unanswered and implications unexplored, to which I say, chill. This is an ongoing series, And you have to acknowledge that this is a school assignment. I've made this heady because I'm in a media anthropology course. And this is the first in a long series, or 7-episode series or so. But there are very particular questions I want to investigate in the future. If my particular remediation of the art for the martyr strategy is to be taken seriously, we must investigate the following questions, which is, if swords are an instrument and a technology, how exactly are they made? And what about the armor that they're made to counter, made to go with? What are the implications of Walpurga's presence in the relation of a theorized martyr stratagem, or the strategy of martyrdom, coming from clerics? What is that religious interplay, that interplay between the German Catholicism and German law codes that we are presented with? Because lest we forget, this is a Germanic text. And of course, how do Aristotle's concepts of time and space influence the writing of this Fightbook? How did Aristotle influence how they perceived time and space and that relationship between the two? And if we're talking about Greek influences, are there any others, as some have proposed? There are other present-day articles that I would like to investigate as well, because I acknowledge that I'm not speaking in a vacuum. I'm not the first to think of this. I'm not the best. I'm certainly not an expert in my field. I am but an amateur. So I will leave many of these questions to future, soon-coming monthly episodes of this academic season. So don't panic. We have plenty of time to discuss all of this, as we are continuing our journey through to investigate the art and science of the Fightbooks. So I would like to say, first of all, thank you to all of you listeners, and thank you to everyone who helps me on this journey. So I'm Endymion for the Dork-at-Arms, etc. Thank you, and ciao.